Hello everyone and welcome back to The Library is Open. So I hope you brought your library card, my darlings. Bit of opera to start us there. So this is something of a special episode, as it were, a special episode. In the sense that I'm not going to be talking about a book or my thoughts on a book here, although it does still concern books, you know, more generally. But this is the video I've been thinking about making, and a very close online friend, very nice person indeed, asked me some questions about a project I've been working on, and rather than sort of waffle on online, I thought actually it might be really nice to make a video about it, just on the off chance that other people are interested as well. So that's the disclaimer done. So this is concerning the adaptation I made of Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde, which I've talked about on this channel as a reader previously. I'll link that in the description if you haven't seen my discussion of the book. And the sort of big news, which if you follow me on social media you'll probably already know, but if you don't, then I was asked to adapt the text into a live performance event, which would be then streamed via Facebook Live from the Pump House in Watford, which is a theatre and art centre. So that was, or rather is, in co-production with a brilliant theatre company called Threedumb, who have already done a number of these sort of live stream broadcasts and won awards for them actually over the period of lockdown. So, you know, there were a couple of ups and downs with that in terms of the, you know, sort of lockdown 2.0 that we're now in, where we weren't sure whether people were going to be able to you know, go into theatre spaces and stream from there, but thankfully what has happened is, although there won't be an audience, the streaming is going ahead and will take place on the 26th and 27th, as I understand, of November. I will link the description of I'll link the event below in the description, and it's free to attend, but perhaps you could give the theatre company, who are the hosts of the event, a like, and sort of give them some support on Facebook. Okay, so yeah, a little bit about what I did in adapting the text, because you know, I just thought that might be quite interesting. I'm interested in adaptations myself, and so I flatter myself that other people might be. So when I was approached to do the adaptation, originally it was that I was asked more generally if there was something I wanted to contribute to this sort of digital streaming situation that was happening, and I sort of then asked, was there anything that the company were interested in, and what came back was Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde. Now, I think like a lot of people, and I, you know, include quite a lot of iconic classic stories or fables and so on and so forth in this. I was aware of the story, and it's one of those stories that I thought I knew, but really well, and then when I actually went back to reread it years after I'd first sort of read it or engaged with it, I found out that it was not exactly what I remembered, which is always interesting, I think, particularly with properties that kind of transcend their original form. Frankenstein, which I'll be talking about in a few weeks, is similar in that respect, in the sense that we all think we know the full story of it, but what actually happens in the original source is not quite what we've seen on the screen. And I think that's totally understandable, because a lot of these properties attain this kind of iconic status, whereby they are no longer indebted to their source material, and they sort of take on a life beyond any kind of tangible product, be that book, be that film, so on and so forth. They sort of pass into like the popular imagination, so we all think they've been around forever. Yeah, and what I was interested in, so yeah, sorry, process. So I went back to the original story. I was surprised to find how much shorter it was that I remembered. For some reason, I had in my head that it was going to be this, or that it was this sort of long, sprawling Victorian novel about, you know, transformation and so on and so forth, and science and so on. But it's actually a really slim volume. It's like a sort of short story, possibly a novella if we're being kind. But in some ways, that was actually quite cheering, because when I was sort of approaching the project, there was a certain amount of both excitement and trepidation. I was like, how am I going to condense this into, you know, a sort of manageable amount of time for that platform? Because, you know, that sort of live streaming kind of event, or online digital theatre output, I think is different than seeing something live in terms of how long people are willing to sit there and engage with it. You know, so we'd sort of determined on about 45 maximum minutes. So obviously, you know, in my head, picturing this sort of 400-page epic, that seemed quite daunting. Although, in other respects as well, I was kind of aware that even if it was that length, there would be a lot of detail that was kind of extraneous, and that what I would do is just pick where the story sat for me. But actually, the shortness of the novel made that a much easier process, and really allowed me to go in and sort of scalpel away what I didn't want, and focus in more specifically on what I did want. Because I knew that also that the cast would be small. In fact, I envisaged it as an entirely one-person show, as the sort of previous productions by the company had been. And there's something I really like about a one-person show. I like the dexterity and the sort of ingenuity that's required by you know, everybody involved creatively, particularly the performer. You know, I think it can truly be a magical experience with this entire world kind of conjured through one person sort of acting as the conduit. So I knew that, you know, practicality dictated really that it should be written for one actor who would play Dr. Henry Jekyll and Mr Hyde. Obviously they occupy the same body. And then as I was going through, I sort of realised that there were moments when I needed other voices in there. And what I could have given all of that to the actor and had him sort of conjure that from like the ether, as it were. I actually thought that, and from respects, it would be nice to have voices, sort of echoes that were not necessarily bodied people. They were sort of these disembodied voices from the ether sort of thing, which I thought worked quite nicely with the character, because Dr. Henry Jekyll sort of repeatedly says, you know, that he is a doctor, so rooted in science, but also a man of God. So, you know, he has a heavy sort of belief in morality, but also presumably the afterlife and so on and so forth. And there was this idea, I think, that, you know, isolated in his room, which is where I chose to set the piece, that, you know, these sort of echoes of past events and so on and so forth would be sort of there with him, almost like ghostly spectral companions. So I wanted to do that, and also it was a really sort of useful way of doing a lot storytelling wise without having to do loads of exposition. Because if you know me, you know that one thing I really hate is exposition for the sake of exposition, particularly in performance scripts. I want to be shown the story, not told the story. That's where the skill lies, I think. Otherwise, why wouldn't I just read the book? It should be a different experience. Which is why I was sort of not beholden too much to the text. As I said before, the text is actually not what you expect. It's epistolary, a lot of it, so told in letters. And actually, Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde themselves get very little screen time, as it were. They're sort of reflected back by people talking about them, but I didn't want to do that because I wanted to put that character sort of centre stage. And so I made the decision that actually what might be quite useful is to place the action as we open the experience, the show, at the very end of the story, which is, you know, when everything's kind of at fever pitch, and then have Jekyll reflect back on what has happened to sort of tie into that spectre idea as well. He sort of, you know, we get this sort of foreboding of doom, and, you know, a sort of cranking up of events that are happening outside the room that we never see, we only hear and experience through the way they affect him. And then as he's reflecting back, that deals with the exposition in a way that feels non-eggy, technical term, non-eggy for the character, and allows me to do a lot very quickly and in a way that feels in keeping with how I've set it up thematically. So yeah, it also has the added bonus of meaning that I can, you know, play around with these ideas around fate, destiny, heaven and hell, and so on and so forth, and have Dr. Jekyll, you know, sort of face that idea of his own morality and mortality at the same time. It's almost like a confession, the way I've sort of crafted it, and you know, to sort of show that continuing eternal conflict, because the thing at the centre of the story is desire for, you know, the conflicting paths, one of which is the right path, the moral path, the God path. One is the inner desire. So yeah, talking a little bit about that as well, I sort of, I kept the sort of Mr. Hyde elements quite ambiguous in some respects. I didn't want, because in the writing actually, he's sort of more fleshed out in some respects as a kind of individual character who has more like humanoid qualities. That surprised me actually on the reread, but I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to put the onus on Jekyll and just have Hyde make a sort of very calculated and you know, impactful appearance, not only for practicalities, because, you know, this actor has to transform, and it's a wonderful actor. We've got Jonathan Davenport, who's wonderful. I haven't seen the performance sort of in situ yet, because I decided to be very hands-off with it in terms of, this is the script now, you go do what you want with it, to the director, the creative team and the actor, which I think is how it should be. But, you know, having sat through read-throughs on Zoom, wonderful, really sort of instinctively got the character just like that, really great. So I'm so happy about that. But I think, yeah, you know, so obviously he's got this, the task of physically and emotionally transforming into Mr. Hyde. So I wanted to keep that so that it wasn't sort of every other minute, you know, because I think what we needed was the build up to meeting this character. And we needed to see him as he emerged and had the effect on Dr. Jekyll, because in the book we sort of don't get Dr. Jekyll's first-hand personal testimony. You know, it's written very much so that we experience it in the third person, but actually I wanted to give that ownership back to Dr. Jekyll in some respects, because I also thought it's really interesting to sort of speculate on someone's, you know, morality and inner conflict when they have to justify themselves and talk about their own process, as opposed to, you know, us assuming or inferring from what other people say. So sort of gave Dr. Jekyll his voice, really. And, you know, I have been speculative in some respects, because, you know, of what Mr. Hyde sort of represents for me, at least, is the sort of suppression of desire. So, you know, being a queer writer as well, I wanted to sort of not definitively say that was, you know, relating to queerness or so on and so forth, but it did feel like there was the opportunity to make a little comment there, particularly given the sort of strictness of society at the time it was written. I thought, wouldn't it be really interesting to sort of let a little bit of ambiguity come in there as to what the actual desires were, you know. So I think that where was I going with this? No, I'm joking. So yeah, I wanted to let those sort of sit there as potentials, and that is slightly a liberty. So what I did was sort of conjecture a lot about Dr. Jekyll's childhood and take him back to like his father's presence in his life at the start. Not layering it on thick, but you know, just making some choices from what I can infer from the text, which is never directly contradicted, so I feel like it's fair game. Again, as I say, if you want ultimate accuracy from Robert Louis Stevenson, you can read the book. This is something different. I suppose as well it's worth mentioning some stuff that I did lift directly from the book because I find it more interesting, which is the actual manifestation of Mr. Hyde, because in, you know, popular cinema and so on and so forth, we've sort of seen him as this sort of humongous, almost Frankensteinian creature that sort of bursts from the vessel of Dr. Jekyll and is physically imposing. But in keeping with the book, and also because, I don't know, there's something quite deliciously dark about it, I sort of specified in the script that actually when the Doctor becomes Mr. Hyde, he shrinks physically and becomes, you know, smaller than the Doctor himself, which actually I really like the idea of, because it's almost like Mr. Hyde is less of an individual person and more of a distilled essence of Jekyll's unexpressed desire. So it's sort of like if you trim the metaphorical fat and pull it right down to the base instincts, this is Mr. Hyde. And I also think there's something creepy about that as well, this sort of diminutive creature who, you know, skulks around alleys at night. There is a sequence where the chorus, if you will, who are other actors voicing some of the characters, are you know, sort of do this overlapping sequence where they talk about, without being explicit, some of the you know, ill-spent evenings of Mr. Hyde, some of which become murderous and so on and so forth. But again, that ties into that idea of I don't want to directly spell out that this is what Mr. Hyde got up to, this is what Dr. Jekyll's desires are, because I think it's just so much more fun to speculate on that. So I played a lot with the ideas around food, food for, you know, the inner desire, food for, or just hunger, really, I suppose, which I've equated with food, because that whole, you know, sex, death, food trope exists for a reason, because it fits really well together. So I sort of visualised a lot of Mr. Hyde as this sort of like tiny little slinky creature who nevertheless is very sort of hungry constantly, and although you know, Henry is very restrained and sort of goes like that and puts his napkin down his thing, Mr. Hyde would just eat the whole thing, you know. So there's a couple of allusions in there to that, and I also just thought, you know, that's quite a nice challenge for the actor as well, to play against type, I suppose, in terms of what is expected of this creature. So yeah, I'm excited about that, and I think there's a subtlety there that I quite enjoy, selfishly perhaps. So in terms of the language and stuff like that, I didn't lift anything directly from the book. We had a conversation earlier on with the director who had sort of said, I sort of floated the possibility as to whether he wanted it to be a contemporary reimagining of the story, or whether he wanted, you know, for it to remain in this sort of, you know, the Victorian era that it was written in. Because originally this was planned for, you know, earlier, so maybe it would have coincided with Halloween, whatever. Anyway, that didn't happen. But I think he and the director Stephen was very sort of keen that it remain in period, which I actually agreed with, because I don't know, there's something very fitting about that period, and as you know, I am obsessed with Victoriana. It's like my favourite period. Not that I'd want to live there, because I'd definitely be, you know, a street urchin or something. And, you know, with this hair, I can't afford it. But there is something very sort of thinking about that period coming up to like the turn of the century and stuff, that I suppose the whole idea of, you know, emerging from a previous incarnation, and the gaslight as well, and the darkness and the fog and so on and so forth of what it reveals and what it conceals just felt appropriate. So what I tried to do was not to copy Robert Louis Stevenson's sort of text style, because that wouldn't have been appropriate, and also it's not an active text, it's meant to be read as a novella, which is different from performative text, which has an active through line that that becomes, even if illogical, in the mind of the character, sequential, from this to this to this to this to this, and it has very definite peaks and troughs in the way that a novel does, but doesn't have to in the same way, because we can choose how we read and consume it. This kind of has to set off, and when it reaches, and once it's set off, it needs to gallop until the end. It can't sag in the middle. So what I tried to do was just approximate the language. So I did a little bit of research into terminology and, you know, the way people would describe things. I had a look about, you know, from my own knowledge about what we know of how the Victorians spoke. Thought about Dr. Jekyll's class and his status in society, and also how I could marry that with what Mr. Hyde would sound like, because technically they are different people, so they should sound different. You know, and rather than sort of go for like a primal language for Mr. Hyde, I chose to make him very poetic almost, in the way that sort of, in that sort of Patrick Bateman in American Psycho kind of way, or I don't know, who else would be a good influence? That's like Tamara, Queen of the Goths from Shakespeare or something. You know, she's very sort of regal, but also quite violent as well. But there's a beautiful chilliness to that language, which is quite sparse, but at the same time quite over the top. Hopefully that makes some sort of sense. And then I contrasted that again with the other voices of the characters, who are, you know, sort of servants and, you know, acquaintances of the Doctor, and, you know, again, looked at their professions, looked at their status, looked at how to, you know, craft speech patterns for them that contrasted enough with Dr. Jekyll, but also spoke to their own sense of self as an individual. Even though we don't see them much on screen, it was important that they had more distinct sensibilities, because they have to. Because we can't see them, we need to fill them in our heads, and the only way to do that is through what they sound like. So yeah, I don't know that I can reveal too much more without giving it away. It was actually a very truncated process in some respects, not intentionally per se, but I actually got the drafting done very, very quickly. There were 3 drafts all in all. The 3rd draft is the current draft that the actors and the company are working with now, as they sort of set things up. I did put in the drafts sort of like ideas about what could be achieved, but actually while not being too out there, I'm from the sort of Mark Ravenhill school of writing stage directions, which is he just writes, I just write what needs to happen, and I let the directors on the creative team make that happen, which is not, you know, in terms of being deliberately supercilious or being very sort of like, ha ha ha, make that happen, but actually it's not your job as the writer to figure it out, because that's somebody else's art, you know, somebody else's job, that they are much better at it than you are. So you just tell them, it's like, say if I need an elephant, I just write, an elephant appears. And then that's down to the creative input of the creatives to make that happen. So I've suggested things, but I still don't completely know what it's going to look like in terms of visuals and stuff, but I completely trust Stephen, completely just Threedumb, completely just Jonathan and the theatre, and I'm sure that they'll surprise and delight me, which is how it should be. It's a collaboration, you know. I wrote the adaptation, little Robbie, my mate, wrote the original, and then they'll interpret it, and that's how I think good adaptation should work. You know, we're not micromanaging each other. You know, so yeah, I think that's pretty much where we are with it. So yeah, so where can you catch the production? You can catch it on Facebook Live on the 26th and 27th of this month. It will thereafter be available. It is free, but if you are able to make any kind of donation whatsoever, there will be information on Threedumb Theatre's page. All of this is linked below in the description. You know, because as I've told you sort of time and again on this channel and also on my social media, this is a really tough time for people working in the arts. I'm very lucky that I also teach, so that I have some income, but some people, you know, have either been furloughed from their sort of other jobs, or not been able to do their jobs and don't have any gigs coming up, and are not eligible for help from our bloody useless government. So if you can afford it all, I appreciate that it's a tough time, but if you can afford it all, to make some kind of donation, that would really, really help support creatives, professional creatives at this time. So I hope you've enjoyed this little dive in to the process of adaptation. Like I say, hopefully I haven't made it sound sort of too mystical or anything, but having had those questions about how I made the show, for which I'm so grateful, by the way, I just thought I'd do this sort of short, it's like half an hour video about what my process was like of working with an existing text. So I hope you'll all join me in watching one of the live streams, and if not, then at least catching up with the show after it's been broadcast. I think it's going to be really exciting. You know, and it is a very sort of 2020 way of experiencing live performance in the best way we're able at this time. So #SaveTheArts. Alright, thank you my darlings. Do check out all those details below, and I will see you for our regularly scheduled programming very soon. Put your library cards safe, stay safe, take care. Mwah.